The capacity of anyone who has a narcissistic personality to shapeshift, to be what the world needs, and then turn into something very different also means that survivors are not believed. Heck, you barely believe it yourself, and you're the one in the relationship. Everyone says it's just a nice guy. Until the story of the hunt is told by the lion, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. I read this and I thought, wow, this just actually captures everything I've been trying to say in all of the work I do on narcissism. It is an African proverb and really captures why it is that narcissistic people have been, continue to be, and always have gotten away with so much for so long. The meaning is obvious. The person who holds the narrative holds the power in many ways, right? And the hunter, the predator, the pursuer is the person who has that power because they're the one who gets to tell the story. This gets at a very big topic, something that has come up in just about every consultation about narcissistic abuse I have ever done. I get this question dozens and dozens of times per week. Doc, why didn't I hear about this sooner? Why weren't we taught this in school? Why aren't more people talking about this? Why don't more therapists talk about this? Each one of those questions is an entire hour conversation. Lots of people actually feel downright betrayed by the idea that nobody ever talked about this or taught anyone about this. It's actually why I do what I do. I'm actually trying to be the lion, I suppose, who's telling the story, I guess, right? I keep a file in my computer. It is dozens and dozens of articles I have come across over the years, up till as recently as today, of news articles and different kinds of articles about every kind of narcissistic person you can think of. From CEOs to doctors to politicians, from stalkers to con men, from Ponzi schemers to grifters, people from all walks of life, all races, all ethnicities, all genders, all ages, all parts of the world. I keep these stories because what's not interesting is their stories. I mean, after a while, all of these narcissistic people's stories read the same. But rather because of the rationalizations for their behavior that are often made in these articles I read, or the unwillingness of people to call the people in these stories narcissistic. The writers will literally use every other word imaginable: difficult, manipulative, charismatic, cunning, glib, intense, chameleon-like, demanding, exacting, visionary, but they miss the clear pattern. And the writers are even shocked when these people are repeat offenders. Now that you understand narcissism, you know it would be shocking if they were not repeat offenders. The hunters are still telling the story, which is why we glorify billionaires and assholes and the grandiose and the arrogant and mean people. I have seen the comments on these videos, folks. We do our best to manage the mean ones, but I've seen them. The trolly folks who make cruel comments about the people who have experienced narcissistic abuse, and that the people who are drawn to this content as being snowflakes or weak. Well, because of course, making mean-spirited, anonymous, mean comments makes you brave and full of fortitude, right? We've got to stop glorifying the tale of the narcissist. We have to stop worshiping at the altar of charisma and charm and glibness and success at any cost. As long as the hunter is telling the story, toxic patterns will be painted as strong and tough and virtuous, and I'm just a little bit of a tough, angry person, but that's all. Think about the danger of this. Throughout history, the existing stories of history normalized authoritarian parents, controlling partners, rageful and abusive bosses, and tyrannical leaders. It is only recent It's only recently that media has become more democratized. Blogs, places like YouTube, and social media have created spaces where a diversity of people, for better or for worse, can share their stories, whereas before that, gatekeepers such as network executives or producers or publishers, they blocked access and only allowed a small group of people to share their stories, which meant we kept hearing only one story, usually the story of the hunter. The bigger problem is sorting through all of what is out there now. But at a minimum, there is a greater diversity of stories out there. I think now we've just got to teach people how to critically think about all of it. Over time, more and more lions are telling stories. These may be survivors, people who are willing to say that relationships characterized by control and dominance and rigid roles and abuse are simply not okay. That manipulation and gaslighting and invalidation and contempt and cruelty are not okay. That justifying toxic patterns is not okay. It's my hope that more and more information about these toxic and difficult personality styles and their impact on relationships will result in more and more people reading a new kind of information, the story that comes from their perspective, stories that don't cultivate self-doubt or celebrate people who behave badly, but confirm our instincts on what is healthy and what is destructive. So let's stop glorifying the hunters and start paying attention to what the lion has to say. It may just save your sanity and your soul. We're going to talk about something that keeps happening and does concern me, which is the fact that a lot of folks keep romanticizing narcissism and sociopathy and psychopathy. So let's take this on. Now, many of you watching this are trying to heal from these relationships, right? And at some weird level, I suppose I get it, and I put get it in quotes. Narcissistic and psychopathic and sociopathic people are interesting. And the rest of us having to manage our unpleasant emotions like guilt and having to spend time with our compassion and empathy and then thinking we didn't do enough, well, that's not nearly as interesting as somebody who's willing to lie, cheat, steal, manipulate, be ridiculously selfish. Nice people aren't as interesting as serial killers, grifters, and perpetrators. Nobody makes podcasts about nice people. But true crime, that genre is killing it. And if you were to look at the lineup of shows on most streamers that you watch TV on, you would actually think that every other person in the world is either in a cult, and if they're not in a cult, that they have encountered a serial killer or are running a Ponzi scheme. That's all part of the glorification of it. And yes, movies and shows and novels and stories about bad people are compelling. And it could be argued that psychologically, we are drawn to these stories because they may serve the purpose of helping us understand what scares us. I get that. But what troubles me is when I see stories that romanticize and, yes, glorify and even make it seem like, whoa, this is cool. Maybe I could learn something from the psychopathic and sociopathic people out there. Everyone in the world has the right to choose the stories that entertain them. But when that gets in the way of us getting a balanced look at what's really happening in the world, that's when I take umbrage with all of this. I've read all kinds of articles. I even read even yet another recently that was sort of singing the virtues of sociopathy. It's a bit of a puff piece, almost glorifying a person who deems themselves sociopathic, as though it was kind of hip and cool to be a person who never feels consequences or feels any guilt. And listen, at some level, I really admire that a publication wanted to share that perspective. I think we only learn by listening to a range of perspectives. But it doesn't work if you don't simultaneously share the perspective of what happens to people in these relationships. And those articles about people who are healing from these relationships, those aren't out there. And when they are out there, the tendency is to paint the person who got into a relationship with someone who's narcissistic or psychopathic or sociopathic as being foolish or codependent. Because actually, no, it's not cool when a person just walks through life guilt-free and shares word salady reasons for how they are so deep despite their lack of capacity to consider others. Those of us who carry guilt often carry it disproportionately because we are also being blamed for the harm that another person has placed on us. Guilt is designed to warn us or inform us that we did something bad, so hopefully we correct it and don't do it again. But when we are in narcissistic relationships, that guilt gets hijacked. We believe we are the bad one. We feel that we are to blame for someone else taking advantage of us. I have read countless interviews with screenwriters and actors who will talk about how much effort they put into wanting to infuse a particularly awful character with humanity. The actor, for example, may be playing a very, very bad person, whether they're violent or torturing or dehumanizing or manipulative, and they try to figure out the complexity of the character and give it depth. Again, I get that and I appreciate it as somebody who's watched and read these stories. But you rarely see these actors and screenwriters wanting to dig the same depth out of kind, good characters who are often played as one-dimensional, strong, silent types. But this zeal to want to infuse the bad person with some kind of compassion so we could understand their humanity and give them some richness, again, it plays on this idea that, well, if you're harmed by a person like this, or you have the audacity to call it out, well, then maybe that's a you thing because you couldn't dig deep enough and find the humanity and complexity in their toxicity. F off. I mean, in these stories that glorify the sociopathic and narcissistic and psychopathic folks, they foster and promulgate the narrative in the world that only a foolish, stupid person would get into one of these situations, that everyone else, oh, they're so smart that they wouldn't fall for a narcissist grift. Listen, to everyone watching, it hasn't happened to you, it's a matter of time. Unless you live in a teeny tiny world with no access to new people, it's going to happen to you. And the more we focus on holding and propping up the narcissistic folks, we then focus instead on shaming the survivors and not calling the harmful behavior harmful. Instead, we shame folks for calling the bad behavior bad. It really is like being in an upside down universe. Maybe because so many of our leaders, heroes, celebrities, you name it, they evidence these patterns, and we want to keep our heroes, that it's easier to attack the people who are harmed because then we can maintain our status quo, but we maintain it at the expense of the people who have already been wounded by the harms and the abuses of these relationships. Listen, I love balance. I think it's science. I think it's what we always have to have. So if journalists and writers want to write stories glorifying and romanticizing narcissism and sociopathy and psychopathy, calling them cool and edgy, and wow, begging the question of how can I be a remorseless, calculating person who gets the job done? That means then we need an equal balance of reading and hearing and seeing what happens to people who are in the relationships with these folks, written with the same awe and reverence and respect that articles often use when they're talking about the clever grift of a sociopathic or narcissistic person. So then at least when people are feeling foolish and devastated and that they are to blame and feel ashamed, that they know, but this is what happens to people in these relationships, that there are other people out there like us that got pulled into and stuck in these relationships. Any of you who have read my new book know that I open the book with the parable of this sort of the take on the hunt, glorifying the hunter and not the lion. Nothing has changed. As long as major media outlets keep running glossy articles on the glory and quirkiness and cleverness of antagonistic personalities like narcissism, folks going through narcissistic relationships the lions, I guess as they are going to keep feeling alone. We, as human beings, write fairy tales about the things that scare us. And maybe that's why this is. But please know, if you're going through this, if you are the tail of the lion, you're not alone. And sadly, until this happens to you, you don't get it. And when it does, the folks who minimize, shame, or write puff pieces, well, they too can come over to this side and learn about narcissism, psychopathy, and sociopathy, and the way it hurts us, like the rest of us did. You know me, I love reading the news and learning about the terrible ways people can treat each other. So let's take a look at how bad it can get and how the really bad behavior that people can rationalize. So I read an article the other day about some really fancy people. And my guess is, I mean, now I actually thought many people didn't read this story, but now more people are talking about it. So maybe more people read this story than I thought, even though the people involved are really esoteric. The people in this story, one was some ballet director person. The other one was a dance critic. Again, not people that most of us are concerned with. The ballet director guy was somebody who's viewed rather grandiosely as the greatest choreographer guy for ballet in Europe. He staged a new ballet, and a dance critic came to see this new ballet, and she wrote a pretty scathing review of it. It happens. People write mean reviews. We live in an era of mean people, so mean reviews aren't exactly a shocker. She's a critic. She criticized. But it doesn't end there. That ballet guy sees the dance critic at some other dance performance, having already read the bad review. He goes up to her and he asks, why did she write what she did? And then he grabs a bag of dog feces from his pocket and smears it in her face. There's also the other question of who carries feces in their pocket to the ballet, but I'm going to have to let that question rest. Now, since he did this, there has been lots of hand-wringing in the European dance world. They wrote it off as an impulsive act. He claims in one report that, he goes on to say that he has apologized profusely. He also wanted to make it less about the dog poop and more about the idea that critics should not be allowed to write such scathing reviews. Now that sounds like a justification to me. She's a critic. She criticized him. I would imagine that that's the job. It sounded like he wasn't happy that she had only written nice reviews about him twice. And then he turned around and made it about gender. One of his colleagues where he works was really effusive in praising him. She called him respectful, empathic. She said this behavior was out of character. I hope so. And then she went on to say his mom was sick, his dog was sick. Let's go back to the initial point. He carried dog feces in his pocket. He saw her. He went up to her. He talked to her. And then he rubbed them in her face. That is intentional behavior. It's not as though they got into a spontaneous shoving match and he grabbed some nearby dog poop on the floor and shoved it in her face. He had numerous moments where he could have decided not to approach her, not to talk to her, and certainly not to have rubbed shit in her face. The metaphor is not lost on me. Now, from a narcissism perspective, this thin-skinned sensitivity is something we often see in narcissistic abuse. Listen, I have no idea if this guy is narcissistic. I have never heard of him. I will never probably hear about him again. But this behavior falls under the clear rubric of antagonistic behavior. To be so thin-skinned that when someone does something you don't like, you feel like you can lash out in this way. All the hand-wringing. He's so creative. He's a great choreographer. Critics need to write nicer reviews so people keep coming to the ballet and supporting it. He is honorable, empathic, respectful. His dog was sick. His mom was sick. This enabling, justifying mess. Just know and stop. He intentionally rubbed dog poop in a woman's face because his feelings got hurt. When we talk about narcissistic behavior, we often get caught up in the gaslighting, manipulative, unempathic, entitled stuff. It misses some of the other dynamics, especially the thin-skinned hyperreactivity. This pattern, the thin-skinnedness, is what leads to the walking on eggshells. You never know what will set them off, or you don't allow yourself to offer any form of feedback or critique because you don't know how they will react. It'll usually be awful, maybe not poop in the face, but rage, cruel clapback, or dysregulation. A familiar enabling refrain when people are reflecting on narcissistic behaviors is that I was just being impulsive. They didn't mean it. They're going through a lot. Or my favorite, it wasn't intentional. Now, given the very low likelihood of a poop bag being a normal accessory to take to the ballet, who knows, maybe this dog of his that was sick was with him, and maybe he did take him out to do his business, and then you take the bag and you put it in the trash, right? And the multiple moments he had, he could have made the choice not to approach this woman. And even if she got into his face, to walk away, it's intentional. His behavior was a choice. There were 3 to 4 steps up to that moment, if not more. His feelings were hurt, his insecurity was activated, and somehow that made it okay to react. And when the people around him are supporting that and not calling the behavior out as unacceptable, listen, he may be a dance genius. I don't know, and it doesn't matter. Being a genius, being an artist, being a tortured soul, being a creative thinker, it doesn't matter. All of this stuff cannot be an excuse for unacceptable behavior, and least of all, because you didn't like a person's assessment of your work. For most of us, if we decided to go dog poop on people's faces every time they criticized us, let me tell you, it would be a messy world. You may be wondering, oh, come on, it's one little petty incident. I'm not so sure. I think that these kinds of petty incidents are becoming a lot more common. And I think that this sort of universal thin-skinnedness coupled with impulsivity and the willingness of so many people to rationalize and justify. I was reading yet another story here in LA about somebody who defrauded one of these PPP things and then went ahead and used that fraud money to buy all kinds of extravagant things. And the people around were saying, he's actually a really great guy, but then something, his drinking caught up with him. No, this is a person who engaged in a bad action and now there's a consequence. I don't know if Dance Guy lost his job. I don't know what's going to happen to him. But for all the rest of us who live in the real world, these kinds of instances are happening more and more, and it gives you an understanding of how much this stuff is enabled by the world at large. And we are actually much more likely to enable that kind of behavior when somebody behaves in such an inappropriate, impulsive way than we are to hold space for people who are often having to grapple with these really difficult relationships. So check out the article. This was a thing. It really happened. I couldn't believe it. There were lots of articles about it. And I gotta say, there were way too many people breaking a sweat trying to understand Mr. Dog Poop's behavior. I was reading an advice column in a very popular and big newspaper, and all I could say was, oh my goodness, no wonder people are struggling with narcissistic abuse. So there's a column in the New York Times called The Ethicist. And in this column, the writer gives advice to people who are going through what are supposed to be sort of ethical dilemmas in their lives. Things like a friend's friend said racist things. Do you call them out? Do you not invite them to another dinner party? Do you skip their wedding? That kind of thing, like sort of values and how to proceed through human relationships, right? I'd say in this column about every other week, the questions are about toxic relationships. Someone in a family, in a relationship, engaging in emotional abuse of some kind. And the person writing the letter may not always be in the relationship, but maybe a friend or a supporter seeking some guidance on how to navigate the situation. The ethicist is not a shrink or a social worker. He is some philosophy teacher or some philosopher dude. He might be useful in situations where the situation is like, if my mother dies and one of my siblings has a history of mental illness and can't work, is it fair if that sibling gets more of the estate? Something like that could be argued philosophically. But in my estimation, it's dangerous to try to argue emotional and narcissistic abuse in that way. And I have to say, maybe 40–50% of the time, this philosopher dude kind of gets it rightish. But most often, because he doesn't seem to understand narcissism, coercive control, enabling, gaslighting, manipulation, invalidation, trauma bonding, his answers actually do come up short, and that can be really problematic. The real money shot on this ethicist column, though, is the comments. His philosophical frame often means that he thinks he's being circumspect, seeing all the positions, being clear on everyone's point of view, respecting family traditions and boundaries, that kind of thing, right? He comes at it very analytically, very logically. But those comments, oh my goodness. When I read those, because those are just people chiming in, I am reminded why surviving narcissistic abuse is so difficult. So to think about this video, I went back through the 4 most recent questions in this column that had an emotional abuse theme. The commenters said things ranging from, well, I just think people are too judgmental these days. Sometimes people say things they don't mean. Get over it. One time doing something bad wasn't abuse. Except that the person was saying this has been happening for years. And then someone else said, well, people just want marriages to end, and people are just against marriage, and marriage is so great. Not for everyone. Then there are the survivor blamers. Well, she's choosing to stay. Maybe she has to take responsibility for that choice. Or they'll blame the survivor for turning to friends for advice, saying that nobody should talk about family problems outside of the family. But the family is abusive, so who are you going to talk to? Then there are the others who say that, well, we don't know the other person's side of it. My family accused me of being a psychological abuser, and then they weren't nice to me when I went to therapy. I said sorry. On and on and on, hundreds of comments that at least half the time, maybe even more, thought that the person that was experiencing the abuse in these questions was weak, weak-willed, wanting attention, wanting sympathy, being too needy, asking too much of friends, didn't recognize relationships or work, and that there are 2 sides to everything. And I was like, wow. So before I sort of sat down and thought about this video, I had read one question that sort of pushed me too far in this column. So I put myself through about 30 to 60 minutes. It was a waste of time in some ways, but I did, of scrolling through these comments. And afterwards, I have to tell you, I just wanted to put my head in my hands and cry. It was then I once again recognized why survivors feel that it is so hopeless, that there is so little support out in the world. I knew it, but seeing the words of so many strangers was just a wow. It's important for me to not gaslight survivors. I get it. If this is the sentiment of the world, how can you really feel safe telling friends or family who apparently feel really put upon because you're the one being harmed in a psychologically cruel relationship? Basically, you're an inconvenience because you're being emotionally abused. This idea that people can just leave a relationship is a very privileged mindset. It doesn't account for money, safety, employability, and affordability, especially if a person has children. It doesn't account for the lack of societal power that people have. Why don't you leave? Why don't you leave? It's such a disrespectful question. Here's a question for you. How about we ask the abusers, why don't you leave? Instead of breaking someone down and manipulating and gaslighting them, why don't you just go because you think this person isn't good enough for you? Instead of abusing this person, why don't you leave? We already know the question. Another question that's even more important is, why do you abuse? We're never going to get the answer to that one. We also know it's not that simple. The capacity of anyone who has a narcissistic personality to shapeshift, to be what the world needs, and then turn into something very different also means that survivors are not believed. Heck, you barely believe it yourself and you're the one in the relationship. Everyone says he's just a nice guy. Sadly, people with big platforms like writers for the New York Times are people with privilege and societal power. From that high altitude, it can be easy to never have to learn about trauma bonding and what happens to people who have no power or people in abusive relationships of any kind, the confusion in economic system that can make it impossible to leave. Listen, I'm based in Los Angeles, and the cost of rent is enough to mean that lots of people in narcissistic relationships have to stay, and they say, this is taking years off of my life, but I simply cannot afford to leave. This is one of those sad, depressing videos where I just don't have an answer. Just when I get hopeful and think that these conversations that I have on YouTube or with podcasts anywhere else, when I think they're getting somewhere, I recognize that the dismissive judgment of so many in the world, especially when it's manifested in the smarty smart types of people that read the New York Times, mean that most survivors, unless they can afford therapy with a really good therapist who understands narcissistic abuse and be able to keep going to that therapy, most people will never get the support they need. This channel is never going to be a substitute for therapy, but I do hope that every so often it's a source of validation and a place where the gaslighting gets turned off. Just one look at those comments is once again a reminder of how real it is. And even if the world refuses to recognize it, even if recognizing that there are such a thing as narcissistic and toxic relationships because it punctures their convenient versions of relationships and families, whatever all that is, let me remind you, this is real. Thanks again.